"I never had a wife," said the virgin rancher when the widow and her children begged for shelter. The snow was falling hard, and a lonely rancher thought he'd spend another winter in silence. But when a desperate widow and her little ones knocked on his door, everything changed. He gave them fire, food, and a place to rest, never knowing that kindness would put his very life and his land on the line. Because in the dusty streets of town, whispers turned to scandal, and a powerful man claimed the widow's children as his own. Keys rattled in the jailhouse. Hooves thundered on frozen ground. A preacher lost his courage. And a hidden truth, tucked away in an old Bible, held the power to bring them all to their knees. Now, with the law against him and the town divided, the rancher must decide, will he risk everything for a family that was never his? Or will his vow, "I never had a wife," be the words that destroy them all? Comment below and tell me where in the world you're joining from. And if this story made you pause for a moment, hit that subscribe button for more. The bitter wind howled across the Colorado plains, driving needles of snow against the small wagon as it lurched through deepening drifts. Amelia McAllister pulled, her thin cloak tighter, trying to shield herself from the merciless cold of early 1881. Her hands, red and chapped, gripped the reins as she guided their struggling horse forward. "Mama, I'm cold," whimpered Mary, her youngest, huddled between her older siblings Thomas and Sarah beneath their shared blanket in the wagon bed. "I know, sweetheart," Amelia answered, her voice barely carrying over the wind. "We'll find shelter soon." But worry gnawed at her heart as she watched their horse's labored breathing, its head hanging low against the storm. The afternoon light was fading fast, shadows stretching across the snow-covered landscape. Panic began to rise in Amelia's chest. They needed to find shelter before nightfall, or the bitter cold would claim them all. Her prayers grew more desperate with each passing minute. Then, through the swirling snow, she spotted it, a warm glow in the distance. Hope surged through her frozen limbs as the light grew stronger. Soon she could make out the shape of a cabin, smoke curling from its chimney. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered, urging their exhausted horse toward the promise of warmth. As they drew closer, she could see it was a proper ranch, with a barn and bunkhouse alongside the main cabin. The buildings were well maintained, speaking of a careful owner. Amelia guided the wagon as close to the cabin as she could manage, her heart pounding. "Children, stay wrapped up," she instructed, climbing down from the wagon seat. Her legs nearly buckled as she trudged through knee-deep snow to the cabin's door. She knocked firmly, trying to be heard over the howling wind. For a long moment, there was no response. Amelia knocked again, harder this time, fear making her desperate. Finally, she heard movement inside, and the door swung open. A tall man stood in the doorway, backlit by the warm glow of a fire. His face was weather-worn, with deep-set eyes that regarded her warily. He wore simple work clothes, and his dark hair was slightly too long, as if he rarely bothered with haircuts. "Please," Amelia said, her voice hoarse from the cold. "My children. And I need shelter from the storm. Our horse can barely stand, and we've nowhere else to go." The man, who she would later learn was Brian Rollins, stood silent for a long moment, conflict clear on his face. "I never had a wife, ma'am," he finally said, his voice rough from disuse. "Never aimed to. This ain't no place for a family." "We won't be any trouble," Amelia pleaded, thinking of her children shivering in the wagon. "Just until the storm passes." Brian's eyes moved past her to the wagon, where three small faces peered out from beneath their blanket. Something shifted in his expression, a softening around the edges of his stern demeanor. "Can't leave you out here to freeze," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "There's room in the bunkhouse. I'll get a fire going." Relief flooded through. "Amelia, thank you," she breathed. "We're much obliged." Brian stepped past her into the snow, his long strides cutting a path to the wagon. "Let's get your horse settled first," he said. "Then we'll see to you and the young ones." He took the horse's bridle, leading it and the wagon around to the barn. The poor beast's sides were heaving, its coat rimed with frost. Brian worked quickly but gently, unhitching the horse and leading it into the warm barn. "Thomas," Amelia called to her eldest, "help your sisters down from the wagon, careful now." The children climbed down, clinging to each other as they made their way through the snow. Brian emerged from the barn and led them to the bunkhouse. a simple but solid structure with a pot-bellied stove at its center. "Ain't much," he said, striking a match to kindle the fire he'd laid, "but it's warm once the stove gets going." The children huddled close to the stove as the flames caught and grew. Amelia helped them remove their wet outer clothes, hanging them near the fire to dry. Their faces were pale with cold, but already beginning to pink up in the growing warmth. Brian disappeared briefly, returning with a pot of beans and some tin cups. "It's plain fare," he said, setting them on a small table, "but it's hot." "It's perfect," Amelia assured him, serving her children first. The beans were indeed simple, but well seasoned and filling. She watched as color returned to her children's cheeks, their shivers gradually subsiding. Little Mary, who was only 4 years old, had nearly fallen asleep over her empty cup. Her head nodded forward, then snapped up as she fought to stay awake. She blinked heavily at Brian, who stood awkwardly by the door. "Huh?" she mumbled sleepily, reaching one small hand toward him. Brian stiffened, his face showing a complex mix of emotions: surprise, discomfort, and something deeper that Amelia couldn't quite name. The words seemed to hang in the air between them, heavy with meaning. "No, sweetheart," Amelia said softly, gathering Mary into her arms. "This is Mr. Rollins. He's kind enough to give us shelter. But the damage, or perhaps the miracle, was already done." That simple word from a sleepy child had cracked something in Brian's carefully maintained solitude. He turned abruptly and walked to the door. "I'll check on your horse," he said gruffly, disappearing into the storm. Later, after the children were tucked into the bunkhouse's narrow beds, Amelia heard Brian return to his cabin. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the bunkhouse, her children slept peacefully in the warmth. In his own cabin, Brian lay awake, listening to the wind's howl. That one word, "pa," echoed in his mind, stirring memories he'd long tried to forget. His mother's voice, gentle but insistent: "Brian, you weren't meant for solitude. The good Lord made hearts for sharing." He dismissed her words then, focusing instead on building his ranch, working from sunrise to sunset, filling his days with physical labor that left no room for loneliness. But now, with a widow and 3 children sleeping in his bunkhouse, he felt the walls of his carefully constructed solitude beginning to crack. The storm raged on, but something else was shifting too, something in Brian's heart that he wasn't quite ready to name. He rolled over, trying to find sleep, but his thoughts kept returning to the way Amelia had looked at him with such gratitude, and the trust in Mary's sleepy eyes when she'd reached for him. Life had a way of surprising a person, he reflected, even out here on the lonely Colorado plains. Sometimes it took a snowstorm to show a man that his carefully planned path might not be the one the Lord had in mind for him. After all, the morning dawned bright and bitter, with frost patterns etched across the bunkhouse windows. The storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine blanket of snow that sparkled under the rising sun. Inside his cabin, Brian Rollins stoked the cook stove and set coffee to boil, the rich aroma filling the small space. Through the window, he watched smoke rising from the bunkhouse chimney. The widow must be awake. Sure enough, moments later, he heard the clear voice of Amelia McAllister calling her children to order. Brian stepped onto his porch, coffee pot in hand, intending to bring his guests their morning brew. But he stopped short at the scene through the bunkhouse's half-open door. Amelia sat on a rough-hewn bench, her 3 children kneeling before her. Morning light streamed through the window, catching the silver threads in her dark hair. Her eyes were closed, hands clasped in prayer. "Dear Lord," she began, her voice steady and warm, "we thank you for your protection through the storm and for the kindness of Mr. Rollins. Guide us in your wisdom as we start this new day." The children echoed amen in small, earnest voices. Brian stood frozen, coffee pot growing cold in his hands. He hadn't heard a family prayer since his mother passed 15 years ago. The simple ritual stirred something deep within him, a longing he'd thought long buried. Thomas, the eldest at 10 years old, spotted him first. "Good morning, sir," the boy said politely, rising from his knees. Amelia's eyes opened, a flush coloring her cheeks. "Mr. Rollins, I hope we weren't disturbing your morning." "No, ma'am," Brian said gruffly, lifting the coffee pot. "Thought you might want some coffee." "That's very kind," Amelia smiled, reaching for the tin cups on the shelf. "Children, Thank Mr. Rollins." A chorus of thank you rose from the little ones. 8-year-old Sarah helped her mother pour, while 4-year-old Mary clung to Amelia's skirts, still shy around their tall host. "Got to tend the cattle," Brian said, already backing toward the door. "Storm likely scattered them. Help yourselves to more coffee." But even as he mounted his horse and rode out to check the herd, Brian found his thoughts returning to that morning. Scene. The quiet authority in Amelia's voice as she led her children in prayer. The way they looked to her for guidance, it painted a picture of family life he'd almost forgotten could exist. The day passed in careful feeding and counting of cattle, some indeed having strayed during the storm. When Brian returned that evening, he found the bunkhouse tidied and a pot of beans simmering on the cookstove, seasoned with herbs Amelia must have brought in her wagon. Over supper, Amelia set down her spoon and squared her shoulders. "Mr. Rollins," she began, "we cannot impose on your kindness indefinitely." Brian looked up from his plate, waiting. "The children and I can work," she continued. "I can cook, clean, mend clothes, whatever's needed until the road's clear enough for travel." "Ain't necessary," Brian muttered, but Amelia pressed on. "Please, we need to earn our keep. I won't have charity, even from someone as kind as yourself." Something in her tone, pride mixed with desperation, made Brian nod. "Reckon there's always work needs doing on a ranch," he said finally. "We'll sort it out tomorrow." 2 days later, the sun rose on a crystal-clear Sunday morning. Brian hitched his wagon early, knowing the road to town would still be rough with snow. He found Amelia and the children already dressed in their Sunday best, worn but carefully mended clothes brushed clean. The ride to town was quiet, broken only by Mary's occasional questions about the wildlife they passed. Brian kept his eyes on the road, all too aware of Amelia beside him on the wagon seat, her skirts brushing his leg when they hit rough patches. The Methodist church sat on the edge of town, its white-painted walls bright against the snow. Lamplight glowed warm through the windows, and the bell tolled a welcome. But as Brian helped Amelia and the children down from the wagon, he noticed the first whispers starting. Mrs. Peterson, the banker's wife, stood with her usual group by the church steps, their heads bent together, eyes darting between Brian and Amelia. Old Walter Jenkins actually stopped mid-stride, staring openly at the unlikely group. Inside, the whispers grew. Brian could feel them like a physical touch as he led Amelia and her children to a pew. Words like improper and scandal drifted past, poorly concealed behind hymn books. Pastor Whitmore took his place at the pulpit, his usually confident demeanor somewhat strained. His sermon spoke of Christian charity and the importance of reserving judgment, but his eyes kept straying to where Brian sat with Amelia and her children. After the service, as families filed out into the cold morning air, Pastor Whitmore caught Brian's arm. "A word, if you please, Brother Rollins." Brian nodded to Amelia to wait by the wagon, then followed the pastor to his study. The small room smelled of lamp oil and old books, its walls lined with theological texts. "Brian," Pastor Whitmore began, his voice careful, "you must understand how this appears to the congregation. A single man housing a widow and her children, without proper supervision. They needed shelter from the storm," Brian said flatly. "Would you have had me turn them away?" "Of course not," the pastor sighed. "Your Christian charity does you credit, but appearances matter in a small town. Reputations can be ruined by less than this." Brian's jaw tightened. "Ain't concerned with appearances." "Perhaps not," Pastor Whitmore pressed, "but consider Mrs. McAllister's position. A widow must be above reproach. The children's future prospects, that's enough." Brian cut him off, harder than he'd intended. "Good day, Pastor." He found Amelia by the wagon, her head bowed and shoulders tight. She must have heard some of the whispers, seen the sidelong glances. The children huddled close to her, sensing their mother's distress. The ride back to the ranch was tense with unspoken words. Finally, as the church spire disappeared behind them, Brian broke the silence. "Don't care what folks think," he muttered, though his knuckles were white on the reins. "Ain't their business." Amelia kept her eyes fixed on the horizon. "You're kind to say so, Mr. Rollins. But Pastor Whitmore wasn't wrong." "I should never have. You needed help," Brian interrupted. "Ain't nothing wrong with that." But even as he spoke, Brian felt the weight of the town's judgment settling around them like a noose. He'd lived alone so long, he'd forgotten how quick people were to assume the worst, how gossip could poison even the most innocent situation. They rode the rest of the way in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The sun climbed higher, making the snow glitter, but its beauty was lost on them. Now, the simple refuge they'd found in these past days suddenly seemed fragile, threatened by the very community that should have offered support. Brian glanced at Amelia's profile, seeing the worry etched in her features. Her hands were clasped tightly, in her lap as if in prayer. He wanted to tell her it would be all right, that they'd find a way through this, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he turned his attention back to the road, guiding the wagon carefully through the drifts. Toward home. The week settled into a rhythm as natural as breathing. Morning brought prayers and coffee, followed by the steady work that kept a ranch alive through winter. Brian found himself watching the way Thomas and 8-year-old Sarah took to their new tasks, eager to prove their worth. "Like this, sir?" Thomas asked, positioning the kindling against the chopping block. His small hands gripped the hatchet with determination. "That's right," Brian nodded, adjusting the boy's stance. "Keep your feet apart, steady now." He stepped back, noting how Thomas's tongue poked out in concentration as he split the wood. Each successful crack brought a proud smile to the boy's face. Sarah proved herself handy too, learning to gather eggs without spooking the hens. Even little Mary helped, toddling after her siblings with a basket, collecting pine cones for the fire. Inside the bunkhouse, Amelia worked her own magic. Her needle flew through fabric as she transformed old flour sacks into simple curtains. The rough-hewn windows, which had stared blank-faced at the prairie for years, now wore cheerful checks of white and blue. "Ain't much," Amelia said when she hung them, "but they'll keep the dawn from waking the children so early." Brian just nodded, but his eyes lingered on the curtains throughout the day. They reminded him of his mother's touch, how she'd always said a house needed softness to become a home. As dusk gathered, purple and deep, Amelia's voice would rise in song. The hymns floated across the yard between cabin and bunkhouse, familiar tunes that Brian hadn't heard since childhood. "Amazing Grace" and "What a Friend We Have in Jesus" drifted through the evening air, making his usual solitude feel emptier than before. One evening, Brian brought over extra lamp oil and found Amelia sitting alone at the rough-hewn table. The children slept in the corner, buried under quilts. The lamplight caught the worry in her eyes as she traced the worn cover of her Bible with trembling fingers. "Something's troubling you," Brian said, setting down the oil can. It wasn't a question. Amelia's shoulders tensed, then slumped. "I haven't been entirely honest with you, Mr. Rollins." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "We didn't leave our home just because of hard times." Brian pulled up a stool, the wood creaking under his weight. He waited, watching as Amelia gathered her courage. "My husband, James, he wasn't good with money." Her fingers kept moving over the Bible's cover, as if drawing strength from its familiar texture. "He borrowed heavily from Silas Henshaw." Brian's jaw tightened at the name. Everyone knew Silas Henshaw, the land baron who'd built his empire on other people's misfortunes. His ranch house stood like a mansion compared to the modest homes of his neighbors, and his influence reached deep into the county government. "How much?" Brian asked quietly. "More than I could ever hope to repay," Amelia's voice cracked. "After James died, Mr. Henshaw sent his men. They said the children could work off the debt. Called it an indenture agreement." Her hands clenched around the Bible. "They wanted to take my babies, Mr. Rollins. Split them up among different ranches, working as servants until they came of age." Brian had heard whispers of such arrangements before. Children bound into service, supposedly for their own good. But he'd also heard darker stories about the treatment of these indentured young ones, especially the girls. "That's why we left," Amelia continued, her voice stronger now despite the tears threatening to fall. "I loaded what I could in the wagon and ran. I know it wasn't right, running from debts, but..." She looked over at her sleeping children, mother love fierce in her eyes. "I cannot let them be taken. I won't." The lamp flickered, casting shifting shadows on the walls. Outside, a coyote called lonely across the prairie, and somewhere in the distance, another answered. "How long ago did you leave?" Brian asked, his mind already calculating distances, possibilities. 3 weeks. Amelia wiped her eyes with her apron. We stayed with different families along the way, never more than a night, but the storm forced us to stop here. She looked up at him, fear and gratitude warring in her expression. I'm so sorry, Mr. Rollins. I never meant to bring trouble to your door. Brian stood, his movements slow and deliberate. You did right by your young ones, he said firmly. Ain't no mother worth her salt would do different. He walked to the window, pushing aside the new curtain to stare into the darkness. His land had always been his sanctuary, his refuge from the complications of other people's lives. Now he found himself tangled in a web of debt and desperation, all because he couldn't turn away a family in need. Henshaw's men, he said, still looking out the window. They'll come eventually. Men like that don't let go easy. I know. Amelia's voice was small but steady. If you want us to leave, no. The word came out sharper than he intended. Brian turned back to face her. Winter ain't done with us yet. Roads are still dangerous, especially with young ones. He didn't mention what they both knew, that traveling now would make them easier to track, easier to catch. Here, at least, they had walls around them and a man who knew how to use the rifle mounted above his cabin. Dordat Amelia bowed her head. God bless you, Mr. Rollins. Brian just nodded, uncomfortable with her gratitude. He walked back to his cabin, each step crunching in the frozen snow. Instead of going to bed, he lit his own lamp and took down his axe. The whetstone made a steady rhythm as he sharpened the blade, his thoughts as dark as the night pressing against his windows. The firelight painted shadows on the cabin walls as he worked. His mother's Bible sat on its shelf, untouched since her passing. She'd raised him on stories of David standing against Goliath, of right prevailing over might. But she'd never told him what to do when right and might came calling together, wearing the false face of law and debt. The axe blade gleamed now, sharp enough to split hair. Brian tested its edge with his thumb, remembering how Thomas had taken to wood splitting, how little Mary called him sir in her piping voice, how Sarah helped gather eggs each morning. Not his family, no, but innocent souls who'd found shelter. Under his roof, he stared into the fire, the axe heavy across his knees. His mother had always said God had a purpose for everything. He wondered if this was his to stand between a widow's children and the men who would take them. To fight, perhaps, though he'd spent years avoiding trouble. The fire popped and sparked, offering no answers. Brian set the axe aside and opened his mother's Bible for the first time in 15 years. As he turned the pages, a pressed flower fell out, a prairie rose, dried and delicate. His mother's favorite, marking the passage about defending the fatherless and the widow. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling his cabin windows. Somewhere out there, Silas Henshaw's men were probably already asking questions, following rumors. And tracks across the snow. They would come, sooner or later, carrying papers that claimed to be legal, demanding children as payment for a dead man's debts. Brian closed the Bible, gentle with its worn leather cover. He didn't know if God expected him to fight for Amelia and her children. But as he banked the fire for the night, he knew he would anyway. Some things were worth fighting for, even if you never meant to find them. The sudden thaw came like God's own breath across the plains, turning packed snow into a sea of mud. Water dripped from eaves and fence posts while new grass peeked through melting drifts. Brian stood on his cabin porch, watching rivulets cut channels through the yard. The warmth meant easier travel, but it also meant others could move more. Freely, too. He needed feed for the cattle. The trip to town couldn't wait, not with his supplies running low. Brian hitched up the wagon early that morning, the horses stamping impatiently in the wet earth. He hadn't planned on bringing company, but Amelia appeared with her children, carrying a basket of eggs to trade. We're near out of flour, she explained, helping little Mary up onto the wagon seat. And the children need more cloth for their winter clothes. Brian just nodded, noting how Thomas and Sarah scrambled up eagerly, faces bright with excitement at the prospect of town. The boy had grown steadier these past weeks, learning to stack wood without toppling the pile. Sarah had her mother's quiet way about her, always watching, always thinking. The wagon wheels cut deep ruts in the muddy trail. Spring birds called from the bare branches overhead, and patches of blue sky showed between scudding clouds. Brian. kept his eyes moving, scanning the hills. Beside him, Amelia hummed softly, though he noticed how she held Mary closer when they passed through the narrow creek bottom. Town appeared through the morning haze, a collection of wooden buildings strung. Along the muddy main street, horses stood hitched outside the mercantile, their riders' boots having tracked mud onto the plank sidewalk. Brian pulled up in front, helping Amelia and the children down. Inside, the store smelled of coffee beans, leather, and tobacco. Mr. Peterson. The shopkeeper nodded to them from behind his counter. "Mornin', folks. Feed came in yesterday, Mr. Rollins. Got it stacked out back." Brian was calculating sacks of feed when the bell above the door jangled. Deputy Jed Kearns stepped in, his badge catching the light. He was young for a lawman, barely. Past 20, with a swagger that spoke more of ambition than authority, his eyes fixed on Amelia like a hawk spotting a rabbit. Well, Kearns moved between the shelves, spurs jingling. "If it ain't the widow, McAllister. Heard tell you might be in these parts." Amelia stiffened, drawing her children closer. "Deputy Kearns." "Funny thing about debts, ma'am." Kearns leaned against a barrel, thumbs hooked in his gun belt. "They don't just disappear 'cause someone dies. Mr. Henshaw's been mighty concerned about your whereabouts." "My husband's debts died with him," Amelia said quietly, but her hands trembled as she gripped Mary's shoulder. Kearns' smile turned ugly. "That ain't how the law sees it. Those papers you ran from? They're legal and binding. Mr. Henshaw's got every right to collect what's owed, including them kids of yours." Thomas stepped forward, fists clenched. "You ain't taking us nowhere." "Hush." "Now," Amelia whispered, pulling him back. Brian set down his ledger and moved between Kearns and the family. "Reckon you're done here, Deputy." Kearns' hand drifted toward his gun. "This ain't your business, Rollins. Best step aside before you find yourself in trouble. These folks are under my roof." Brian's voice was quiet but iron hard. "That makes it my business." The deputy's eyes narrowed. "Harboring runners from the law? That's a serious matter. Mr. Henshaw won't take kindly to interference." "Ain't harboring nothing." Brian didn't move. "Just giving shelter to neighbors in need. Like any Christian man would do." The tension stretched tight as fiddle strings. Sarah and Mary pressed against their mother's skirts, eyes wide with fear. Mr. Peterson watched from behind his counter, hands hidden below the wooden surface where Brian knew he kept a shotgun. Finally, Kearns straightened, adjusting his gun belt. "Well, ain't you the regular Good Samaritan?" His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Just remember, Mr. Henshaw always collects what's owed, one way or another." He tipped his hat mockingly to Amelia. "Ma'am." The bell jangled again as he left. Brian watched through the window as the deputy mounted up and rode toward the saloon. Mud sprang from his horse's hooves. Amelia sagged against the counter, her face pale. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Rollins. I never meant for you to be threatened on our account." "Ain't nothing to fret over," Brian said gruffly, though his heart was pounding. He turned to Mr. Peterson. "We'll need that feed loaded up." They finished their trading quickly, feed, flour, cloth, and other necessities passing across the counter. The children stayed close to their mother, all their earlier excitement drained away. Even young Mary seemed to understand the gravity of what had happened. The ride home was quiet, save for the creak of wagon wheels and the occasional snatch of birdsong. The sun was dropping toward the western hills when they finally pulled into Brian's yard. As they unloaded their purchases, Amelia touched Brian's arm. "What you did back there?" She swallowed hard. "Standing up to Deputy Kearns like that. I don't know how to thank you." Brian shook his head. "No need for thanks. Just did what needed doing." That evening, over bowls of beans and cornbread, the children's fear spilled out in nervous chatter. "Did you see his gun, Mama?" Thomas asked, his voice high and tight. "He wanted to shoot Mr. Rollins, I just know it." "That deputy's a mean one," Sarah added, pushing her food around. "Like them men what came to our old house. He can't really take us, can he?" Mary's lower lip trembled. "I don't want to go." "That's enough," Brian cut in, sharper than he meant to. The children fell silent, but their eyes still held shadows of fear. "Finish your supper now." Later, after Amelia had taken the children back to the bunkhouse, Brian stood at his cabin window. His Winchester rifle felt solid in his hands as he watched the dark hills. The moon cast silver light on the wet earth, making shadows dance like prowling creatures. For the first time since his mother's death, Brian found himself forming words of prayer. They came hesitant and rough, more feeling than formal speech. He asked for strength, not for himself, but for the little family in his bunkhouse. For wisdom to know the right path. For courage to walk it, whatever the cost. The rifle's stock was smooth under his calloused hands, worn from years of use. He'd never shot a man, though he'd killed his share of wolves and mountain lions. But watching Kearns today, seeing the fear in those children's eyes, Brian knew that harder choices lay ahead. A coyote called from the ridge, its voice rising lonely in the night. Brian kept his vigil at the window, the rifle ready, his prayers still echoing in the silence of his heart. The days settled into a gentle rhythm at the Rollins Ranch. Morning light found Brian in the barn, Thomas and Sarah trailing behind him, like eager shadows. Their small boots made hollow sounds on the wooden floor as they followed his every move, watching with bright eyes as he demonstrated the proper way to check leather for wear. See here? Brian ran his fingers along a cracked saddle strap. This is what happens when you don't oil the leather regular. Could break clean through when you're riding. Thomas nodded seriously, while Sarah reached out to touch the worn spot. Her fingers were delicate, like her mother's. Can we fix it, Mr. Rollins? Reckon we can. Brian pulled out his tin of saddle soap. First lesson in ranch work, taking care of your tools. They worked together, the children's hands growing confident with practice. Brian found himself smiling more, surprising himself with patience he never knew he had. From the kitchen, Amelia's voice drifted out, singing an old hymn as she worked. The sound wrapped around them like warm sunshine. Inside, Amelia had transformed the cabin's musty interior. Floors that hadn't seen soap in years now gleamed. Fresh curtains hung at the windows, and the scent of baking bread replaced the stale bachelor air. She moved with quiet purpose, her skirt swishing as she worked, pausing now and then to check on little Mary, who played with a rag doll in the corner. One crisp morning, Brian led a gentle pony from the barn. Mary's eyes went wide as saucers when he lifted her onto its back. Her small hands clutched the mane, but fear melted into delight as Brian led them in slow circles around the yard. "Look, Mama," she called out, sitting straighter. "I'm riding." Amelia watched from the porch, her face glowing. "You surely are, sweetheart." Brian felt something catch in his throat at the sight of them. Mother and daughter, their faces bright with joy. The ranch hadn't heard children's laughter in all the years he'd lived here. Now it seemed to echo from every corner, bringing life to places long silent. Word spread through the scattered homesteads about the barn Brian needed to raise. Neighbors began arriving early that Saturday morning, wagons loaded with tools and food. Women carried covered dishes while men hefted timber and hammers. The Anderson family brought their 4 boys, the Petersons their teenage daughters, and old Jim Wheeler drove his mule team all the way from Crooked Creek. The morning air rang with the sound of hammers and saws. Men called to each other as massive beams were lifted into place. Brian found himself working alongside folks he'd barely spoken to in years, sharing jokes and stories as they labored. Sweat ran down his back, but his heart felt lighter than it had in memory. Amelia organized the women's efforts, directing the setup of long tables groaning with food. She moved easily among them, her natural grace drawing others in. Even Mrs. Wheeler, known for her sharp tongue, softened as Amelia showed her daughters how to arrange the dishes. "Such a blessing, having young ones about again," Mrs. Wheeler remarked to her friend. "This place needed a woman's touch, if you ask me." Sarah and Thomas darted between the workers, carrying water and tools. Their eager helpfulness drew smiles from the men, who took time to show them simple tasks. Mary stayed close to her mother, but her shy smiles won hearts just as surely. As the sun began to set, the new barn stood proud against the purple sky. Lanterns were lit, casting warm light over the gathering. Someone brought out a fiddle, and feet began tapping in the dirt. Brian watched as couples started dancing, the music weaving through the twilight air. Mary tugged at his sleeve. "Up, please?" she asked, arms raised. Without thinking, Brian swung her onto his shoulders. She squealed with delight, tiny fingers gripping his hair. The sound drew Amelia's attention, and she moved to stand beside them. Her hand found his, squeezing gently. "Thank you," she whispered, voice thick with emotion, "for everything." Brian felt the warmth of her touch spread through him like summer sunshine. Around them, some neighbors smiled approvingly at the picture they made, a man, a woman, and a child together in the gathering dusk. But he caught other looks too, sharp glances and whispered conversations behind raised hands. The widow Carsons. Lips pressed into a thin line as she watched them, while Deacon Phillips shook his head with obvious disapproval. The rumors had been building, Brian knew. A single man and a widow living on the same property, children or no, was bound to set tongues wagging. But in that moment, with Mary's weight warm on his shoulders and Amelia's hand in his, he found it hard to care what anyone thought. Later, after the neighbors had gone and the children were asleep in the bunkhouse, Brian and Amelia sat by the fireplace. The flames painted shifting patterns on the walls as they talked quietly about the day's events. Neither mentioned the looks they'd received or the whispers they'd overheard. Instead, they spoke of the barn's solid bones, of the children's excitement, of the community's generosity, but something had shifted between them, as subtle and significant as the changing seasons. It lived in the comfortable silence that stretched between their words, in the way their eyes met and held across the firelight. Neither spoke of it directly, yet both felt its presence as surely as the warmth of the flames. Amelia's fingers moved steadily with her mending, but her voice was thoughtful when she finally spoke. It was good to see everyone come together like that. Reminds me of the community I grew up in before, she trailed off, her needle pausing. Before everything changed? Brian offered quietly. She nodded, eyes still on her work. The children need that sense of belonging. They've lost so much. Seems to me they're finding their place here well enough. Brian added another log to the fire, watching the sparks rise. Thomas has a real way with the horses. And Sarah, that girl's got a mind for figures that'd put a banker to shame. A smile touched Amelia's lips. They look up to you, you know. Especially Thomas. He tries to walk just the way you do. The words warmed Brian more than he cared to admit. He'd never thought to have children looking to him for guidance. Never thought to have evenings like this, sharing the day's events with someone who cared. To listen. The life he'd built for himself, solitary, ordered, predictable, had been changed by their arrival as surely as spring changes winter. The fire crackled softly, filling the comfortable silence between them. Through the window, stars pricked the dark sky, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. Brian was acutely aware of Amelia's presence across from him, the whisper of her needle through cloth, the soft sound of her breathing, the way the firelight caught in her hair. They sat together until the flames burned low, neither wanting to be the first to break the spell of quiet companionship that had settled over them. When Amelia finally rose to return to the bunkhouse, her hand brushed his shoulder lightly as she passed. The touch, brief as it was, lingered like a promise neither of them was ready to voice. A week after the barn raising, dust rose on the horizon as Pastor Whitmore's buggy approached the ranch. Brian watched from the corral, where he'd been mending a loose rail. The clergyman's unexpected visit stirred an uneasy feeling in his gut. The pastor's horse pulled up near the house, wheels crunching on gravel. Pastor Whitmore stepped down, brushing trail dust from his black coat. His face was grave beneath his wide-brimmed hat. "Brother Rollins," he called out, "might I have a word?" Brian set down his hammer and crossed the yard. "Pastor," he nodded, "didn't expect to see you out this way. Perhaps we could speak privately?" The pastor's eyes flickered toward the house, where Amelia could be seen through the window, hanging wash. Brian led him to the barn, where fresh-cut timber still carried the scent of pine from the raising. They stood in the cool shade, Pastor Whitmore's fingers worrying the brim of his hat. "Brother Rollins, I come with concerns from the congregation." The pastor's voice was measured, careful. "There's talk about the widow McAllister and her children staying here, about propriety." Brian's jaw tightened. "They needed shelter, still do." "No one questions your Christian charity," Pastor Whitmore said. "But a single man housing a widow, people wonder about your intentions." "My intentions?" Brian's voice grew sharp. "Never asked for any of this. Never planned on marriage or family. But came to my door half frozen, that's all." The pastor's eyes softened with understanding. "Perhaps not planned, no. But hearts get entangled all the same. I've seen how you look at those children, how they've taken to you. And the widow herself." Brian turned away, unable to meet the knowing gaze. The pastor was right. Something had grown here, tender as spring grass, unexpected as wildflowers after rain. The town's a powder keg of gossip, Pastor Whitmore continued. Some say you're living in sin. Others claim you're taking advantage of her desperate situation. A few defend you, but, he sighed heavily, you must see how this appears. Brian's hands clenched at his sides. Don't care what folks think, but you should care about her reputation, about the children's future. The pastor placed a gentle hand on Brian's shoulder. These things matter in a small town. You need to decide what path you're taking here, for all their sakes. The words hung heavy in the barn's dimness. Brian stood silent, chest tight with emotions he couldn't name. I'll pray for wisdom for you both, Pastor Whitmore said finally. He turned to leave, then paused. Remember, Brother Rollins, sometimes God's greatest gifts come wrapped in circumstances we never chose. Brian watched the pastor's buggy disappear into the distance, dust settling in its wake. The afternoon sun slanted long shadows across the yard as he walked back to the house, his mind churning. Inside, he found Amelia at the stove, stirring a pot of stew. The children were playing quietly in the corner, Thomas with his wooden horse, Sarah reading to little Annie. The scene struck him with its simple rightness, like a painting he'd seen somewhere and forgotten. Amelia, he said softly, need to talk with you. She must have heard something in his voice, because she set down her spoon and followed him to the porch. The spring evening was cooling, carrying the scent of sage on the breeze. Pastor Whitmore came to see me, Brian began, watching her face. About us, about you staying here. Amelia's hands twisted in her apron. What did he say? Brian told her, watching color rise in her cheeks. When he finished, she trembled like an aspen leaf in wind. I never meant to cause scandal, she whispered. Never meant to burden you with our troubles. We can leave, find somewhere else. No. Brian said firmly. That's not what I'm saying. He struggled to find words for the feelings tangled in his chest. Just need you to know what's being said, what people think. Amelia's eyes filled with tears. I'm grateful, more than I can say, for all you've done, for how you've cared for the children, but I won't have your reputation ruined because of us. Before Brian could respond, a harsh cough rang out from inside. Annie's coughing had grown worse through the day, but this sound was different, deeper, more ragged. Annie. Amelia rushed inside, Brian closed behind. The little girl sat in Sarah's lap, face flushed with fever. Her small chest heaved as another cough tore through her. Amelia gathered her daughter close, feeling her forehead. She's burning up, she said, voice tight with fear. Brian's heart clenched at the sight of Annie's struggle for breath. Without thinking, he knelt beside them, taking the child's tiny hand in his rough one. Her fingers were hot, like coals from the fire. Need to cool her down, he said. I'll fetch water from the well. While Amelia stripped off Annie's dress, Brian brought fresh water and clean cloths. They worked together, bathing the girl's hot skin, murmuring soft words of comfort. Thomas and Sarah huddled nearby, eyes wide with worry. As night deepened, Annie's fever raged. Her cough shook her small frame, each one cutting into Brian like a knife. He found himself praying, really praying, for the first time in years. Please, Lord, he whispered, still holding her hand. Please help her. Amelia's quiet voice joined his, reciting psalms as she stroked her daughter's hair. The intimacy of their shared vigil made all talk of scandal seem hollow, meaningless. Horses' hoofs passed on the road outside, slow and deliberate. Brian went to the window, pulling back the curtain. In the moonlight, he caught the gleam of a badge, Jed Kearns, making his patrol. The deputy's shape was dark against the night sky, a reminder of threats still circling. Brian's hand tightened. On the curtain. Here in this room, everything that mattered was contained. A sick child, a worried mother, 2 frightened siblings, and his own heart opening despite itself. Outside, danger watched and waited, but for now, his focus was on the small hand he held, the prayers he whispered, and the woman whose strength and grace had changed everything. Annie's breathing gradually eased as midnight approached. Her fever still burned, but the terrible coughing grew less frequent. Amelia sagged with exhaustion, dark circles under her eyes. Try to rest, Brian told her softly. I'll watch over her. Amelia looked at him, something deep and unspoken passing between them. She nodded, settling into a chair beside Annie's bed. Without letting go of her daughter's other hand, through the night, they kept their vigil together, while outside, Jed Kearns rode his circles, and the stars wheeled overhead, marking time's slow passage. Everything the pastor had said about intentions and reputations felt distant now, overshadowed by the simple truth of love growing where it hadn't been planted, taking root in soil that had long lain fallow. The first rays of dawn painted the sky in pale gold when Brian stepped out to begin his morning chores. Frost sparkled on fence posts, and his breath made clouds in the crisp air. He headed to the well, pump handle gleaming with ice, ready to draw water for the stock. The handle moved wrong. Brian felt it immediately, a grinding resistance that shouldn't be there. He worked it harder, but instead of water, only a thick sludge emerged. Frowning, he knelt to examine the pump more closely. "Something ain't right," he muttered, running his fingers along the metal. In the growing light, he could see dark mud packed deliberately into every crevice. This was no accident. Someone had fouled the well on purpose. Thomas and Peter, Amelia's boys, came running out to help with chores as they did every morning. They stopped short when they saw Brian's thunderous expression. "Boys," Brian called, straightening up, "need you to take the buckets down to the creek. We'll have to haul water until I get this fixed." "What happened to the pump, Mr. Rollins?" Thomas asked, eyes wide. Brian chose his words carefully. "Someone's been mischief-making. But don't you worry about that. Just keep your sister and Mama supplied with water while I work on this." The boys nodded solemnly, gathering the wooden buckets. Brian watched them head toward the creek, their small figures determined against the morning sky. His jaw clenched as he turned back to the pump. This was Silas's work, clear as day, or his men's. At least hours passed as Brian labored to clear the sabotage. He had to completely disassemble the pump mechanism, scraping out packed mud from every joint and valve. The sun climbed higher, sweat mixing with grime on his face despite the cool air. Every now and then he'd glance up to check on the boys, making their water runs, their buckets getting heavier as the morning warmed inside the house. He could hear Annie's lingering cough. The child was improving, but still weak. They needed clean water now more than ever, and Silas knew it. This wasn't just mischief. It was a message. By late afternoon, Brian finally had the pump working again. Clean water flowed strong and clear, but the victory felt hollow. He washed up and headed inside, body aching from the work. Amelia had supper waiting, a simple meal of beans and cornbread. The children were unusually quiet as they ate, the day's tensions hanging heavy in the air. Even little Annie seemed to sense it, picking at her food without her usual chatter. When the children had been tucked into bed, Amelia joined Brian by the fire. Her face looked drawn in the flickering light, shadows under her eyes from nights of worry. "They won't stop, will they?" she said softly, staring into the flames. "Silas and his men, they'll keep coming until they've broken us completely." Brian watched her profile, noting the trembling in her hands as she clasped them in her lap. "We're not broken yet," he said firmly, "but we will be." Her voice cracked. "First the threats in town, then watching the ranch, now this. They'll take everything, piece by piece, until there's nothing left. Until I have no choice but to give them what they want." "That won't happen," Brian growled. "I won't let it." Amelia turned to him, eyes bright with unshed tears. "You've already done so much, risked so much. I can't ask for more." Before Brian could respond, the night split with the sound of approaching hooves. Multiple riders, moving fast and hard. Brian was on his feet in an instant, grabbing his rifle from above the fireplace. "Get the children," he ordered, away from the windows. Amelia rushed to gather her little ones while Brian moved to douse the lamps. But before he could reach them, something crashed through the barn window with explosive force. Glass shattered as a brick thudded against the far wall. Thomas, who had been checking on the horses one last time, let out a frightened cry. The brick had missed him by inches. Brian's rifle cracked in the darkness, sending a warning shot over the riders' heads. Hooves thundered in chaos as the attackers scattered, melting into the night like shadows. Their laughter drifted back, mocking and cruel. When the sound of horses had faded, Brian found the family huddled together in the kitchen. Annie clung to her mother, face buried in her skirts. Sarah held Thomas, who was still shaking from his close call. Amelia stood straight-backed, one hand stroking Annie's hair, the other gripping Sarah's shoulder. "Anyone hurt?" Brian asked, his voice gentle despite the rage burning in his chest. They shook their heads. Brian set his rifle aside and knelt to check Thomas more closely, making sure no glass had caught him. "You're all right, son," he said softly. "You're safe now." The boy nodded, but his eyes were wide with lingering fear. Brian felt something fierce and protective rise in his chest. These children had become his to defend, whether he'd planned it or not. They stayed close together as the night deepened, no one wanting to separate after the attack. Brian built up the fire while Amelia made tea with shaking hands. The children huddled on the floor near the hearth, drawing comfort from its warmth and light. Finally, as midnight approached, Amelia spoke into the quiet. Her voice was steady despite the fear they'd endured. "We can't run forever," she whispered. "We need to stand." Brian looked at her across the firelight, seeing the steel beneath her gentle exterior. He reached out and took her hand, his rough fingers closing over her smaller ones. No words were needed. His grip said everything. They would face whatever came together. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the night stretched dark and deep, full of hidden threats. But inside this room, something stronger than fear had taken root, the determination of a family choosing to stand its ground. Come what may. Brian kept watch until dawn, his rifle close at hand. The brick lay where it had fallen, a reminder of how close they'd come to tragedy. But as he looked at the sleeping faces of Amelia and her children, he knew running was no longer an option. Whatever Silas had planned, they would meet it here, on this land, together. 3 days after the night attack, Brian rode into town alone, his horse's hooves kicking up dust from the drying spring roads. The morning sun cast long shadows between the buildings as he made his way to the telegraph office. Something in his gut told him trouble was brewing. He'd seen Silas's men riding the boundaries of his grazing lands yesterday, marking things in notebooks. The telegraph operator, Jim Wheeler, looked up as Brian entered. The man's usually friendly face was drawn with concern. "Been waiting for you, Brian," he said, holding out a yellow paper. "This came through early this morning." Brian took the telegram, his weathered hands unfolding it carefully. As he read, his jaw tightened. Silas Henshaw had filed legal papers, claiming rights to Brian's grazing lands, citing some obscure boundary dispute. And worse, he'd simultaneously filed to collect on Amelia's debt, demanding immediate payment or seizure of assets. "There's more," Jim said quietly. Silas rode in at dawn, went straight to the county clerk's office. Been there all morning with his lawyer. Brian nodded grimly, tucking the telegram into his vest pocket. "Much obliged, Jim." The county clerk's office sat at the end of the dusty street, its windows gleaming in the morning light. Inside, Brian found Albert Morris, the clerk, hunched over his desk with stacks of papers spread before him. The man barely looked up as Brian entered. "Mr. Morris," Brian said, keeping his voice level, "understand there's some question about my grazing rights." Albert shuffled papers nervously, still not meeting Brian's eyes. "Mr. Henshaw has submitted documentation showing prior claim to those water rights. Mr. Rollins, everything appears to be in order." "In order?" Brian stepped closer to the desk. "I've worked that land for 8 years. Never heard a word about disputed boundaries until now." "Well, yes, but..." Albert glanced toward the back office, where Brian could hear low voices. "Mr. Henshaw has provided substantial evidence, and given his standing investments in the county, the implication hung heavy in the air. Silas's money spoke louder than truth, and everyone knew it." Brian's hands clenched at his sides. "And what about the McAllister debt?" he pressed. "Those children going to be thrown out in the street over their dead father's dealings?" Albert finally looked up, his face pinched with discomfort. "Mr. Henshaw is within his legal rights to collect. The debt is clearly recorded." "Legal rights don't make it right," Brian said quietly. The clerk just shrugged, already turning back to his papers. Brian stood there a moment longer, fighting down the urge to sweep everything off that desk. But violence wouldn't help, would only give Silas more ammunition. The ride home seemed longer than usual, the weight of worry pressing down on Brian's shoulders. The sight of smoke rising from his chimney, of the children playing in the yard, squeezed his heart. They'd made this place a home. And now Silas meant to take it all. Amelia looked up from her mending as Brian entered, her quick eyes taking in his expression. But he forced a smile, not wanting to burden her with this news just yet. "Everything all right?" she asked softly. "Just fine," he said, hanging up his hat. "Boys did a good job with the fencing while I was gone." She nodded, though. He could tell she wasn't fooled. Amelia had learned to read trouble in men's faces long ago. Still, she didn't press him. Just went back to her sewing while little Annie played with a rag doll at her feet. Evening brought them all together around the table, as it always did now. The lamp cast a warm glow as they finished their simple supper. Afterward, Amelia brought out her husband's Bible, a nightly ritual that had become precious to them all. "Shall we read together?" she asked, opening the worn leather cover. The children gathered close, even Brian settling into his chair by the fire to listen. Her voice was clear and steady as she read from the Psalms. "God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore will not we fear, though the earth be removed, and though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea." As she turned the pages, Brian noticed something, a slight bulge in the Bible's back cover, where papers appeared to be tucked away. His heart quickened, but he kept his face neutral, not wanting to interrupt this moment of peace. Amelia continued reading, her words bringing comfort to the children's faces. Thomas and Peter sat cross-legged on the floor, while Annie leaned against her mother's knee, eyes heavy with sleep. "Though an host should encamp against me," Amelia read softly, "my heart shall not fear. Though war should rise against me, in this will I be confident." When she finished, she closed the Bible carefully, her hand lingering on its worn cover. "God will not abandon us," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "He never has." Brian watched her place the Bible back on its shelf, his mind racing with possibilities. Could those hidden papers hold something important? Some proof of payment or evidence of Silas's schemes? But he held his tongue. There would be time enough to look into it tomorrow. For now, he helped Amelia get the children ready for bed, his worry hidden behind gentle words and steady hands. As he tucked Annie into her quilts, she reached up to touch his cheek. "Good night, Mr. Brian," she murmured sleepily. "Good night, little one," he whispered back, his heart aching with the need to protect them all. Later, in the quiet of the kitchen, Amelia stood at the window, gazing out at the starlit prairie. Brian wanted to tell her about the telegram, about Silas's legal maneuvers. But seeing her there, strong yet vulnerable in the lamplight, he couldn't bring himself to break this moment of peace. Instead, he joined her at the window, their shoulders barely touching. Together they watched the night wind move across the grass, each lost in their own thoughts, each drawing strength from the other's presence. The Bible sat on its shelf behind them, its hidden contents waiting to be discovered. But for now, faith and family were enough to hold back the darkness gathering at their borders. The morning sun had barely touched the horizon when hoofbeats thundered into the ranch yard. Brian stepped onto his porch, coffee cup still in hand, to find Deputy Jed Kearns leading 3 armed men toward the house. The deputy's face wore a smirk that made Brian's stomach tighten. "Morning, Rollins," Kearns called out, his voice carrying a false cheerfulness. "Got some business to attend to." Brian set his cup down slowly, aware of movement behind him as Amelia appeared in the doorway. The children clustered at the window, their small faces pressed against the glass. "What kind of business?" Brian asked, keeping his voice steady. Kearns pulled a paper from his vest pocket with flourish. "Got here a warrant for your arrest. Seems some of Henshaw's cattle been turning up with altered brands. Witnesses place you in the area." "That's a lie," Brian said firmly. His hands clenched at his sides as anger rose in his throat. "I've never stolen so much as a calf in my life." "Well, now that's for the judge to decide." Kearns dismounted, spurs jingling as his boots hit the dirt. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back, Rollins. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Brian heard Amelia's sharp intake of breath behind him. The children had come out onto the porch now, Thomas and Peter standing protective in front of their little sister. He couldn't risk a fight, not with them watching. "Brian," Amelia's voice trembled, "they can't do this." "It'll be all right," he said softly, though his heart pounded as Kearns approached with the shackles. The iron felt cold against his wrists, the click of the locks echoing in the morning quiet. Amelia stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "This is wrong, Deputy Kearns. Everyone knows Brian Rollins is an honest man." Kearns barely glanced at her. "Ma'am, I suggest you keep quiet. Wouldn't want folks thinking you're involved too." The threat in his voice was clear. Annie began to cry, her small shoulders shaking as Brian was led toward the waiting horses. He wanted to comfort her, to tell the children everything would be fine, but Kearns yanked roughly at his chains. "Mount." "Up," the deputy ordered. Holding the reins of a spare horse, it was a struggle to get into the saddle with his hands bound, but Brian managed. As they rode out, he twisted in the saddle for one last look. Amelia stood straight and tall on the porch, holding Annie while the boys pressed against her skirts. The sight of them there, vulnerable and alone, cut deeper than any knife. The ride to town seemed endless. Dust clouded around their horses' hooves, and the morning sun beat down mercilessly. People stopped to stare as they rode down Main Street, whispers following in their wake. Brian kept his head high, though shame burned in his chest at being paraded through town like a common criminal. The jail was a small brick building beside the sheriff's office. Kearns marched him inside, past empty cells to the last one in the row. The door clanged shut with terrible finality. "Comfortable?" Kearns taunted, hanging the key on a distant hook. "Better get used to it. Cattle theft's a hanging offense in some places." Brian said nothing, just sat on the narrow cot and watched the deputy strut away. Through the small barred window, he could see clouds gathering on the horizon. A storm was coming, and Amelia and the children would face it alone. Back at the ranch, Amelia moved through the day in a daze of grief and fear. She fed the children, tended to essential chores, but her mind raced with worry. As evening settled over the prairie, she finally got the little ones to bed, though they were too frightened to sleep easily. Annie's voice quavered in the darkness. "Mama, when's Mr. Brian coming home?" "Soon, sweetheart," Amelia whispered, smoothing the girl's hair. "Try to rest now." Once the children's breathing had steadied into sleep, Amelia sank into Brian's chair by the cold hearth. Tears she'd held back all day finally spilled down her cheeks. The house felt enormous and empty without his steady presence. "Lord, help us," she prayed softly, her hands clasped tight. "Show us a way through this darkness." As if in answer, a memory surfaced. Her husband, John, sitting at their old kitchen table late at night, scribbling in the margins of his Bible. He'd been agitated, muttering about keeping records straight and proof of payment. She'd thought little of it then, too worn down by their constant financial struggles. Amelia rose quickly, striking a match to light the lamp. The Bible sat in its usual place on the shelf, its leather cover worn smooth by years of handling. With trembling fingers, she opened it and began to turn the pages slowly, scanning the margins. There, in John's cramped handwriting beside Psalm 23. Paid Henshaw in full, May 15, 1879. Kept receipt. Her heart pounding, Amelia examined the Bible's binding more closely. The back cover seemed slightly thicker than it should be. She carefully worked her fingernail under the leather and felt something crinkle. Using a darning needle, she gently loosened the ancient glue holding the cover's lining. A folded paper slipped out, yellow with age but still intact. Amelia's hands shook as she unfolded it. It was a deed of payment, dated and signed by Silas Henshaw himself, acknowledging receipt of $2,000 from John McAllister. At the bottom was a clear statement, "All debts herewith settled in full." "Oh, John," she whispered, tears falling again, but these were tears of relief and gratitude. Her husband had protected them after all, hiding away this precious proof where Silas would never think to look. Amelia clutched the Bible to her chest, its familiar weight now holding new hope. The document wouldn't just save her family from Silas's claims, it might help free Brian too. The thought of him sitting alone in that jail cell made her heart ache. Looking out the window at the gathering storm clouds, she offered up another prayer of thanks. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but tonight she had found the weapon they needed to fight back against Silas's lies. Thunder rumbled in the distance as Amelia carefully tucked the deed back into the Bible for safekeeping. She checked on the children one more time, then banked the fire for the night. Despite her worry for Brian, a new strength filled her heart. God hadn't abandoned them after all. He'd just been waiting for the right moment to reveal his grace. Dawn broke cold and clear that Sunday morning. Amelia's hand shook slightly as she braided Annie's hair, weaving blue ribbons through the dark strands. The boys stood nearby in their best shirts, freshly pressed despite the tremor in their mother's fingers as she'd worked the iron. "We must look our finest today," Amelia told them softly, smoothing Peter's collar. "The Lord deserves our best, especially when we seek His help." The Bible lay wrapped in a clean cloth on her bed, the precious deed still hidden within its leather covers. She'd stayed up half the night praying over it, asking for guidance and courage. The walk into town felt longer than usual. Annie's small hand clutched hers while Thomas and Peter flanked them protectively, trying to mirror Brian's steady stride. Dust from the dirt road clung to their Sunday boots, but Amelia kept their pace dignified and unhurried. Main Street was busy with townfolk heading to church, their wagons and buggies raising clouds in the morning light. Several families avoided meeting Amelia's eyes, hurrying past with whispered conversations. She held her head high, though her heart ached at their judgment. The white-painted church stood proud against the blue sky, its bell tolling across the prairie. Amelia paused at the bottom of the steps, gathering her strength. The Bible felt heavy in her hands, weighted with purpose. "Remember," she whispered to her children, "God sees truth, even when people don't." Inside, the sanctuary hummed with conversation that died to watching silence as they entered. Amelia guided her family to a pew near the back, feeling the weight of stairs. Near the front, Silas Henshaw sat in his usual place of prominence, his gray head held high with smug authority. Pastor Whitmore stood at the pulpit, shuffling his notes with nervous hands. His eyes flickered between Amelia and Silas, then dropped to his Bible. The organ began to play, and the congregation rose to sing, but Amelia barely heard the familiar hymn through the pounding of her heart. When the music faded and Pastor Whitmore stepped forward to begin his sermon, Amelia drew a deep breath. Her fingers tightened on the Bible as she stood, her voice carrying clear across the sudden stillness. "Pastor Whitmore," she said, trying to still the tremor in her words. "Before you begin, I must speak." Whispers rippled through the church. Annie pressed closer to her skirts while the boys straightened their shoulders. Pastor Whitmore blinked in surprise, his mouth opening and closing before he managed. "Mrs. McAllister, this is hardly the time." "It is exactly the time," Amelia interrupted, her voice growing stronger. "For weeks now, lies have poisoned this community. Lies about Brian Rollins, who showed Christian charity to my children and me. Lies about debts that were already paid." She lifted the Bible high, its leather catching the morning light through the windows. "My husband, John McAllister, left proof of truth in these holy pages." Silas Henshaw's chair scraped as he stood, his face darkening. "Now see here." "No." "Mr. Henshaw, you will see." Amelia's hands were steady now as she opened the Bible and withdrew the yellowed paper. "This deed shows my husband paid his debt to you in full, $2,000, in May of 1879. Your signature marks it settled." Gasps filled the sanctuary. Someone muttered, "Lord have mercy." Silas's face had gone from red to pale. "That's nonsense," he blustered, but his voice held a note of fear. "Some kind of forgery, your own signature." "Mr. Henshaw," Amelia continued, her voice ringing with conviction. "The same signature that's on every contract in the county clerk's office. The same signature you've used to threaten other widows and farmers." More murmurs rose, angry now. Several men stood to get a better look at the paper Amelia held. "Pastor." Whitmore stepped down from the pulpit, his expression troubled. "Mrs. McAllister," he said softly, "may I see this deed?" Amelia walked forward, her skirt swishing against the wooden floors. Every eye followed her progress up the aisle. She handed the document to the pastor with trembling dignity, then turned to face the congregation. "I stand here not just for myself," she declared, "but for my children. I will not see them enslaved to pay a debt that was already settled. I stand for Brian Rollins, a good man imprisoned on false charges. And I stand for truth, which God commands us to uphold." Pastor Whitmore studied the deed carefully, then looked up with tears in his eyes. "This appears genuine," he announced. "The watermark, the notary seal, all proper and legal. Impossible." Silas sputtered, but several townsfolk were shaking their heads. Come to think of it, old Mr. Jenkins called out, didn't John McAllister sell his best breeding stock that spring? Said he needed ready cash. And wasn't that right when you started pressing other folks for loans, Silas? Another voice added, like he needed to make up for lost money? The pastor raised his hands for quiet, his face heavy with shame. I must confess my own sin in this matter, he said. I let gossip and appearance cloud my judgment. I failed to defend the widow and orphan as Scripture commands. Mrs. McAllister, I humbly ask your forgiveness. Amelia's eyes filled with tears, but she kept her voice steady. There is always forgiveness in God's house, Pastor. She turned to face Silas, who had sunk back into his pew, his arrogance crumbling. As for you, Mr. Henshaw, I expect Brian Rollins to be released from jail today. And I expect you to withdraw all claims against my family's property. Or what? Silas growled, but his bluster was hollow now. Or I expect these good people will ensure justice is done, Amelia answered, gesturing to the congregation. Gods. Truth has a way of spreading once it sees light. Approving murmurs filled the sanctuary. Several of the town's leading men were already heading for the doors, presumably to see about Brian's release. Pastor Whitmore carefully folded the deed and handed it back to Amelia. Shall we pray? He suggested, his voice thick with emotion. For guidance, for forgiveness, and for the courage to stand for truth, as Mrs. McAllister has shown us today. The congregation bowed their heads. Amelia felt Annie's small hand slip into hers as they knelt. Tears of relief and gratitude slid down her cheeks as the pastor's words washed over them all, asking God's blessing on their community and his protection for those who stood firm in faith. Through the church windows, morning sunlight streamed down, warm and golden. Like God's own smile of approval. Brian sat on the hard jail cot, his back against the cold stone wall. Sunlight filtered through the barred window, casting shadows that reminded him of long-ago mornings in his mother's kitchen. Her words echoed in his mind, clear as yesterday. The good Lord never meant for a man to live alone, Brian. It withers the soul. He dismissed her wisdom then, too wrapped up in his pride and independence. Now, thinking of Amelia's gentle strength, and the children's laughter filling his empty rooms, his mother's truth struck deep. The jailhouse door creaked open. Jed Kern stepped inside, his young face drawn with worry. The deputy's spurs clinked against the wooden floor as he approached the cell. Mr. Rollins, Jed said, his voice rough with emotion. I got something to say. Brian stood slowly, watching the younger man's internal struggle play across his features. I never wanted this, Jed continued, gripping his hat in trembling hands. Silas, he took me in when I was just a boy. Said he'd make something of me. But what he's done, what he made me do, he swallowed hard. It ain't right. Before Brian could respond, voices erupted outside. The door burst open as several townsmen rushed in, led by Mr. Jenkins from the general store. Jed, Jenkins called out, you heard what happened at church? The widow McAllister showed proof. Silas was lying about everything. Yet's face paled. She had proof? A signed deed, another man confirmed, clear as day. Now unlock that cell, before more wrong gets done. The deputy's hand shook as he fumbled with the keys. The lock clicked open and Brian stepped out, his joints stiff from the cold cell. Your horse is tied up outside, Jenkins said, clapping Brian's shoulder. Reckon you've got some business to attend to. Brian nodded grimly. That I do. Outside, the spring air felt sweet with freedom. His bay stallion nickered a greeting as Brian swung into the saddle. The leather creaked beneath him, familiar and right. He turned the horse's head toward Silas's ranch, 6 miles across the prairie. As he rode, memories of the past weeks flooded his mind. Annie's small arms around his neck, the boys learning to mend fence, Amelia's quiet strength. His mother had been right. A man wasn't meant to live alone. But God, in his wisdom, had sent him something better than just a wife. He'd sent Brian a whole family to love and protect. Never had a wife, he whispered into the wind, but Lord, above, you've given me folks worth fighting for. His horse's hooves thundered across the plains, eating up the distance to Silas's ranch. Brian's jaw set with determination. The time for running and hiding was done. Today he would face Silas Henshaw man to man, and with God's help, bring this fight to its end. Brian reined his horse to a stop in Silas Henshaw's dusty yard. Ranch hands paused their work, watching as he dismounted. Silas emerged from his house, a smirk playing across his weathered face. "Come to beg forgiveness, Rollins?" Silas called out, strutting forward. "That widow's brought nothing but trouble to your door." Brian stood his ground, shoulders squared. "Only trouble I see is a man who'd steal children to settle a debt that's already paid." "Family?" Silas sneered. "They ain't your blood. Just strays eating your food and wearing out your welcome." "Blood ain't what makes family sacred," Brian declared, his voice carrying across the yard. "And no man will steal those children while I draw breath." Hands hovered near pistols as tension crackled through the air. Then hoofbeats thundered and Pastor Whitmore rode in, leading a group of determined townspeople. "It's over, Silas," the pastor called out. "The truth's been revealed, and the town stands with Brian and Amelia." Silas's face twisted as he counted the mounting opposition. His shoulders sagged, though hatred still burned in his eyes. "This ain't finished," he snarled, backing toward his house. "Mark my words, you'll regret this day." Brian's heart hammered in his chest, but he stood firm. Amelia's unwavering faith had carried them through, just as she promised it would. The county courthouse buzzed with tension 2 days later. Morning sunlight streamed through tall windows as Amelia stood before the judge, her husband's Bible clutched tight. Her fingers trembled as she presented the hidden deed, its creased pages telling their own story of truth long buried. Witnesses stepped forward, one by one, confirming what many had suspected: Silas's documents were clever forgeries. The judge, a stern-faced man with silver hair, studied the papers carefully before raising his gavel. "This court finds in favor of Mrs. McAllister," he declared. "All claims against her children are hereby dissolved, and Mr. Rollins's grazing rights are restored in full." Silas's face darkened like a thundercloud. He shoved back his chair and stormed from the courtroom, boots echoing against wooden floors. Outside, beneath the courthouse oak, Amelia turned to Brian with tears glistening. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Brian scuffed his boot against the dirt, heart pounding. "Miss Amelia, I never knew how to be a husband. Never. Thought I would be. But if you're willing to teach me, I'd surely like to learn." Amelia's hand slipped into his warm and certain. "Perhaps," she said softly. "God wrote this chapter of our lives long before we knew to read it." Back at the ranch, golden lamplight spilled from windows into the gathering dusk. The familiar scent of fresh bread and stew filled the kitchen as Amelia stirred the pot, her movement sure and peaceful. Through the window, she watched Brian showing the boys how to properly stack firewood against the coming cold. When they gathered around the worn table, the evening meal felt different somehow, warmer, more complete. Annie's small hand reached for the biscuits, but a cough rattled her chest. Worry crossed Amelia's face as she helped her daughter sip some water. Later, as Annie lay tucked in her bed, Brian knelt beside her, his weathered hands clasping her tiny fingers. Amelia stood in the doorway, watching as this once solitary man bowed his head. "Lord," Brian began, his voice rough with emotion, "I ain't been much for praying since Ma passed. But I'm grateful for this roof, for these children." He paused, swallowing hard. "For the love you've brought into this home. Thank you for second chances." Tears slipped down Amelia's cheeks as she watched the man who'd never wanted a family become the answer to her prayers. Outside, snow drifted silently across the Colorado plains, but within these walls, something precious had been born, a home built on faith and love. If something in this story whispered to your spirit, stay a while. Subscribe and come back tomorrow. The next story may be the one you didn't know you needed.